grieving widow in heavy black silk stood over a fresh grave in Derby, Connecticut. To the town, Lydia Sherman was a woman cursed by unimaginable tragedy. To history, she would be known as the Derby poisoner. She did not use a knife, a gun, or brute force to end the lives of the men she buried. The deadliest weapon of the 19th century was never hidden in the shadows. It was purchased in broad daylight at the corner grocery store, right alongside the weekly sugar and flour. In the 1860s, the United States was a society where danger did not lurk in the dark. It sat comfortably in the parlor. It was an era that courted poison without ever quite recognizing its face. Arsenic was not an exotic, regulated chemical whispered about in back alleys. It was, quite literally, everywhere. It was the vibrant, highly sought-after emerald dye that colored the fashionable wallpaper of respectable homes, slowly shedding toxic dust onto the families sleeping beneath it. It tinted children's toys and the wrappers of penny candies. It was the active ingredient in Fowler's solution, a cosmetic tonic carefully measured out by women to maintain the pale, delicate complexion demanded by high society. And, perhaps most casually of all, it was the primary weapon against the rampant vermin of 19th century cities. Sold under innocent, utilitarian names, like the soon-to-be ubiquitous Rough on Rats, it was a completely normalized household staple. A woman looking to buy it did not need to seek out a black market. She only needed to run her daily errands. Before she became a figure of historical infamy, Lydia was simply a wife trying to survive the shifting fortunes of her era. Her first husband was a man named Edward Struck. He was a New York City policeman, a profession that offered a steady wage, a modest pension, and a respectable, predictable place in the world. For years, they lived within the ordinary, quiet rhythm of a working-class family raising children. Then, the rhythm abruptly broke. Edward was dismissed from the police force. The exact circumstances of his termination were swallowed by time, but the immediate crushing consequences fell squarely on his household. Stripped of his badge, his income, and his pride, Edward Struck unraveled. He did not simply lose a job, he lost his anchor to reality. As the family plunged into sudden, deep poverty, Edward sank into a profound melancholia. He spent his days muttering to himself, unable or unwilling to find new work, while the debts mounted and the physical walls of their home seemed to close in around them. The respectable life Lydia had secured was gone, replaced by a desperate, daily struggle to keep her children fed. It was during this suffocating period of quiet desperation that Lydia took a short walk to her local pharmacy. The apothecary shops of the era were warm, fragrant places, lined with wooden shelves, holding glass bottles of tinctures, herbs, and everyday remedies. She approached the counter and spoke to the pharmacist. She complained of a rat problem in their crumbling home. It was an entirely ordinary complaint. The cities were infested, and a family living in rapidly diminishing circumstances would naturally have trouble with vermin. She asked for arsenic. The pharmacist did not hesitate. He reached for a small, unexceptional paper package from a nearby shelf and handed it over the counter. He did not ask her to sign a poison registry. He did not ask for a reason beyond the perfectly logical one she had freely offered. There were no background checks, no waiting periods, and no suspicion. Lydia opened her purse and paid him a few pennies. The entire transaction took less than a minute. There was no grand, sinister music playing in the background of her life in that moment. There was no trembling hand or guilty glance darting around the shop. It was a transaction as routine as buying a sack of flour, a tin of cheese, or a pound of sugar. Death was entirely accessible, packaged neatly on a wooden shelf, waiting to be carried home in a woven basket. The terrifying truth of 19th century America was not that murder was easy to commit. It was that the absolute most effective tool for it was legally, casually, and cheaply handed over to anyone who asked. Lydia walked out of the warm pharmacy and back into the cold reality of a home filled with poverty and a husband lost to madness, carrying a permanent solution that had cost her less than a loaf of bread. To understand how a woman could poison her husband in a crowded city and walk away without a single whisper of suspicion, one must first understand the medical reality of the era. America in the mid-19th century was a landscape periodically ravaged by microscopic terrors. Successive, catastrophic waves of cholera had swept through the nation in 1832, 1849, and 1866, leaving a lingering, collective trauma in their wake. Typhoid, dysentery, and unnameable intestinal plagues were ordinary specters in neighborhoods where sanitation was poor and drinking water was frequently contaminated. Death by sudden, violent illness was not a mystery to be solved. It was a mundane, accepted fact of urban life. This prevailing atmosphere of disease provided the perfect, unwitting camouflage for a quiet murder. When ingested, arsenic operates within the human body as a ruthless, highly effective mimic. It acts as a severe gastrointestinal irritant, destroying the body from the inside out. The physiological effects of acute arsenic poisoning begin with a sudden onset of nausea, followed by severe twisting abdominal cramps. This escalates rapidly into violent vomiting and relentless, catastrophic diarrhea. The victim suffers from an unquenchable thirst, a burning sensation in the throat, and a rapid, terrifying dehydration that leaves the skin cold to the touch and the eyes deeply sunken into the skull. Crucially, in a time before sophisticated blood panels, diagnostic imaging, and tissue pathology, these were the exact indistinguishable symptoms of cholera and severe gastric fever. When Edward Struck suddenly fell violently ill, his symptoms did not raise an alarm of foul play. They simply mirrored the tragic, everyday afflictions of the poor. His decline was a spectacle of sheer agony. For several days, the former policeman writhed in his bed, his body desperately trying to purge the heavy metal that was systematically shutting down his vital organs. Throughout this excruciating descent, Lydia remained firmly by his bedside. She played the role that 19th century society explicitly expected of her. The dutiful, helpless wife, frantically tending to a dying husband, wiping the sweat from his brow, and perhaps offering him gentle sips of broth or water. Water that only served to deliver more of the white powder into his failing system, hastening his inevitable end. Eventually, the agonizing struggle ceased, and an attending physician was summoned to the quiet house. The doctor stepped into a home steeped in the familiar scent of poverty and grief. He examined the emaciated corpse, noting the classic, undeniable signs of severe dehydration and acute gastric distress. He looked over at the weeping woman standing in the corner of the room, her head bowed in sorrow. In the 1860s, the medical profession was deeply reliant on visual observation and prevailing environmental context, rather than rigorous chemical certainty. The doctor had seen hundreds of men die exactly like this, from tainted food, foul water, or the lingering remnants of a brutal summer cholera season. There was absolutely no medical or social reason to suspect that the grieving widow had deliberately laced her husband's meals with the same cheap, unregulated powder she used to clear her cellar of rats. The physician opened his leather medical bag, took out his pen, and confidently filled out the official death certificate. The cause of death was recorded on the official ledger as gastric fever, though in other similar cases of the era, it might just as easily have been written off as consumption or cholera morbus. The paperwork was filed with the city. No police officers were called to the residence to investigate a crime scene. No autopsy was ordered, and no coroner demanded to examine the chemical contents of the dead man's stomach. The bureaucratic machinery of death processed Edward Struck with a terrifying, unquestioning efficiency. Edward was buried in the cold earth, and Lydia Struck emerged from the ordeal not as a prime suspect in a homicide, but as a recognized tragedy of the community. She dressed in the heavy black fabrics of formal mourning and received the solemn, heartfelt condolences of her neighbors. She had committed the ultimate transgression against human life, yet the system had completely absolved her, without even realizing a crime had taken place. She had not outsmarted a brilliant detective, nor had she been forced to devise an intricate, impossible plot to cover her tracks. The doctors of her time were not her adversaries. Their ignorance was her absolute greatest ally. When examining the terrifying frequency of domestic poisonings in the 19th century, modern observers inevitably ask the same logical question. Why didn't these women simply pack a bag, walk out the front door, and leave a miserable marriage behind? The question itself is a luxury of the modern age. It assumes that the door was unlocked. For a woman like Lydia Sherman living in the 1860s, walking out was not an act of liberation. It was an act of legal and social suicide. The architecture of their entrapment was built upon a fundamental legal doctrine known as coverture. Under this deeply entrenched system, the moment a woman recited her wedding vows, her independent legal identity was completely extinguished. In the eyes of the law, the husband and wife became one person, and that person was the husband. A married woman did not legally exist. She could not sign a contract, she could not draft a will, and she could not be sued. More critically, she could not own property. Any money she brought into the marriage, any land she inherited, and every single penny she earned through her own labor immediately became the exclusive property of the man she had married. If a husband chose to drink away his wife's wages or gamble away her inheritance, the law offered her no shield. Furthermore, the children born to the marriage belonged entirely to the father. If a woman attempted to flee an abusive or destitute home, she was forced to leave her children behind. A mother had no legal right to custody, even if her husband was a violent drunkard. The courts offered divorce only under the most extreme, publicly humiliating circumstances. To dissolve a marriage, a woman had to stand in open court and prove severe, life-threatening physical cruelty or blatant adultery. It was a vicious, expensive spectacle that permanently ruined a woman's reputation, marking her as damaged goods in a society obsessed with feminine propriety. Even if she miraculously won her freedom, she would be cast out onto the streets without a dime of the property she may have originally owned. Cut off from her children and barred from most respectable means of employment. The arithmetic of the situation was brutally simple. A bad marriage was a life sentence, enforced by the full weight of the patriarchal state. After the quiet, unremarkable death of Edward Struck, Lydia found herself alone and financially precarious. She soon married her second husband, a man named Dennis Hurlburt. He was significantly older and possessed considerable wealth. On paper, it was a practical arrangement designed to secure her future. In reality, the marriage quickly deteriorated into an unbearable trap. The specifics of their domestic misery, whether it was cruelty, profound incompatibility, or simply the suffocating reality of being legally owned by a man she despised, were locked behind the closed doors of their respectable home. What is certain is that Lydia surveyed her options. She could stay and endure decades of misery in a gilded cage, waiting for an old man to die naturally. Or she could attempt to run, instantly rendering herself a penniless, disgraced outcast. Neither option was acceptable. The law had meticulously closed every visible door, bolted every window, and built a wall around her life. But the law had left one glaring, fatal loophole completely unmonitored. Faced with a system that offered no viable exit, Lydia did not panic. She did not scream or violently rebel. She simply resorted to the only informal divorce paper available to a desperate woman of her era. She turned her attention away from the courts and the judges and walked back to the quiet shelves of the local pharmacy. The cold, calculated arithmetic of a woman cornered by her own society had yielded a singular, terrifying answer. It was far easier, far cheaper, and infinitely more socially acceptable to be a grieving, wealthy widow than it was to be a divorced, destitute woman. She reached for the white powder once again. Dennis Hurlburt died exactly as Edward Struck had died. The attending physician saw a wealthy, elderly man succumb to a severe, sudden intestinal illness, a tragic but entirely ordinary end for someone of his advanced years. When the earth finally settled over his fresh grave, Lydia walked away not as a destitute, discarded woman, but as a widow of considerable, independent wealth. The trap had worked flawlessly a second time. She had successfully bypassed the ironclad laws of coverture, securing property, thousands of dollars, and absolute financial autonomy through the simple, silent application of a common household pest control. She had learned a dark, undeniable truth during those agonizing nights by the sickbed. The white powder did not merely offer an escape from poverty or cruelty. It offered a profound, terrifying level of control over her own destiny. Yet, the comfortable security she purchased with Hurlburt's life proved remarkably short-lived. Driven by societal expectations, or perhaps a fatal miscalculation, she soon married her third husband, Horatio Sherman. It was a decision that would rapidly unravel the quiet, affluent life she had so ruthlessly constructed. Horatio was not a mild-mannered civil servant like Struck, nor was he a frail, easily managed senior like Hurlburt. He was a deeply volatile, heavy drinker. He brought chaos, loud arguments, and the constant looming threat of physical abuse directly into her parlor. He was a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted, fully expecting his new wife's carefully acquired wealth to seamlessly become his own, to squander at the local taverns. For Lydia, who had already tasted the ultimate, absolute power of life and death over the men who tried to govern her, this sudden, violent loss of control was completely intolerable. The pacing of her lethal interventions began to accelerate rapidly, shifting from acts of desperate self-preservation into a cold, terrifying efficiency. The hesitation that might have accompanied her first crime was now entirely gone. Furthermore, Horatio did not come to the marriage alone. He brought children from a previous union into the house, dependents who constantly threatened to drain the estate's resources and complicate her absolute, unquestioned ownership of the household. Lydia did not view these children as a newly formed family to be nurtured. She viewed them as financial burdens and irritating obstacles. The arsenic, once strictly reserved for the men who legally trapped her, was now ruthlessly deployed to simply clear the board. The stepchildren suddenly fell violently ill, one after the other. Their small, fragile bodies, ravaged by what doctors once again dismissed as severe gastric distress or summer cholera, gave out quickly. They were buried in rapid, shocking succession. The town of Derby wept for the devastatingly unlucky Sherman household, completely blind to the apex predator quietly operating in their own kitchen. With the children permanently removed, she turned her undivided, chilling attention back to the primary source of the chaos. She no longer waited for a moment of profound despair to compel her hand. Murder had simply become her default method of conflict resolution and household management. When Horatio, drunk and belligerent, demanded his liquor, she dutifully obliged him. She quietly, methodically stirred the tasteless, odorless arsenic directly into his daily glass of whiskey. When he later complained of the burning cramps and requested a warm drink to soothe his perpetually ailing, poisoned stomach, she stirred another heavy dose into his hot chocolate. She watched him drink it down. She sat calmly across the table, maintaining the perfect facade of a concerned wife, as the poison began its final, agonizing, invisible work inside him. The deaths were no longer drawn-out affairs plagued by second thoughts. They were swift, highly practiced, and executed with the incredibly steady hand of a woman who had entirely lost her fear of earthly consequence. In the eyes of the 19th century courts, a husband possessed absolute, unquestionable dominion over his household, and a wife was legally expected to endure whatever harsh conditions he chose to impose. Marriage was designed by law to be a life sentence, but Lydia had appointed herself the executioner, 3 dead husbands, a household systematically emptied of its children. In the close-knit, observant community of Derby, Connecticut, sympathy slowly began to curdle into something far more dangerous. The town began to whisper. At first, it was nothing more than the hushed conversations of neighbors gathered on wooden porches or speaking quietly in the aisles of the very same grocery stores where the white powder was so freely sold. They had pitied the grieving widow when Edward Struck passed away in poverty. They had offered their solemn, respectful condolences when the wealthy Dennis Hurlburt succumbed to his sudden, tragic illness. But the rapid, violent demise of Horatio Sherman, coming so swiftly on the heels of the stepchildren's deaths, stretched the limits of human credulity to its breaking point. 19th century society was deeply conditioned to view women as inherently fragile, passive creatures incapable of calculated brutality. Yet, the statistical impossibility of one woman suffering such an unrelenting streak of devastating luck became too glaring to ignore. People began to look at the widow Sherman not as a tragic victim of cruel providence, but as a deeply unnatural anomaly. The black silk mourning dresses she wore so frequently began to look less like a symbol of grief and more like a permanent, chosen uniform. The whispers of the working class might have remained nothing more than cruel town gossip, if not for the shifting perspective of the local medical establishment. A respected physician, Dr. Beardsley, had been called to attend to Horatio Sherman in his final, agonizing hours. Beardsley was an experienced practitioner, fully accustomed to the brutal realities and high mortality rates of 19th century ailments. But the manner of Horatio's death deeply unsettled him, haunting his thoughts long after the death certificate had been signed. He had stood by the bedside, watching the man writhe in an agony that seemed entirely disproportionate to a standard bout of gastric fever. The symptoms had been too extreme, the physical decline too rapid, the sheer violence of the abdominal distress too perfectly aligned with the classic textbook presentations of heavy metal poisoning. The cholera camouflage that had protected Lydia for nearly a decade was finally wearing thin. Dr. Beardsley began to mentally review the terrifying, undeniable arithmetic of the Sherman household. He voiced his concerns, tentatively at first, and then with growing, firm conviction to the local authorities. The medical establishment, which had unwittingly served as Lydia's greatest shield by blindly writing away her murders as natural tragedies, was now slowly turning into her most formidable adversary. Lydia possessed the finely tuned survival instincts of a woman who had spent her entire adult life navigating deadly traps. She did not need to wait for a formal accusation or a knock on the door from the local constabulary to know that the atmosphere in Derby had fundamentally changed. She could feel the sudden, icy chill in the greetings of her neighbors and see the lingering, suspicious stares when she walked down the street. Sensing the shifting tide of public opinion and the looming threat of an actual, formal investigation, she packed her remaining belongings. She fled Connecticut entirely, slipping away across state lines into New Jersey. It was a highly calculated retreat. She hoped that physical distance, combined with the notoriously fragmented, uncoordinated nature of 19th century law enforcement, would simply erase her trail. She believed that if she could just remove herself from the immediate judging gaze of Dr. Beardsley and the gossiping townspeople of Derby, the past would remain safely buried where she had left it. She assumed the authorities would simply lose interest in a widow who had quietly moved on. She was wrong. The machinery of justice, though agonizingly slow to start, had finally been set into motion and could not be halted by state lines. Driven by the relentless public outcry in Derby and the firm, documented medical suspicions of Dr. Beardsley, the local authorities made a grim, unprecedented decision. They did not immediately send detectives chasing after the vanished widow in New Jersey. Instead, they went straight to the cemetery. Armed with shovels, lanterns, and a legal mandate, men approached the freshly turned earth of the local graveyard. It was a severe, deeply unsettling procedure in an era that viewed the disturbance of the dead with profound religious apprehension. But the need for truth had finally superseded the sanctity of the grave. They ordered the exhumation of Horatio Sherman's body. The dirt was methodically pulled back. The heavy wooden coffin was raised from the darkness and brought back into the light of day. For 10 years, Lydia Sherman had relied on the absolute finality of the grave to hide her quiet, desperate, and ruthless rebellion. She believed the earth would swallow her sins forever. But science was about to wake the dead when the heavy, earth-stained coffin of Horatio Sherman was pried open. The investigation shifted abruptly from the realm of small-town gossip into the sterile, unforgiving domain of 19th century science. The exhumed stomach tissue was carefully removed, sealed in glass jars, and transported to a dedicated chemistry laboratory. In the dim light of gas lamps, amidst a complex maze of glass tubing, bubbling flasks, and caustic acids, a meticulously eerie process began. The forensic experts were preparing to employ a revolutionary technique that was slowly but surely beginning to transform American jurisprudence. The Marsh Test. Invented in 1836 by a British chemist, the Marsh Test had taken decades to fully integrate into the American legal system. But by the late 19th century, it had become the ultimate nightmare for domestic poisoners. The premise was as elegant as it was deadly to the guilty. The scientists took the decomposed organic tissue of the dead man and treated it with zinc and sulfuric acid. If arsenic was present in the remains, the resulting chemical reaction would produce arsine gas. This toxic vapor was then channeled through a narrow, heated glass tube. The laboratory technicians watched the glass intently, waiting for the dead man to speak. As the heat interacted with the invisible gas, a stark, undeniable physical transformation occurred. A dark, highly reflective, metallic silver mirror began to condense and coat the inside of the cold glass tube. It was the absolute, irrefutable chemical signature of arsenic. The poison that had seamlessly masqueraded as cholera, the silent killer that had hidden in plain sight on the shelves of the local pharmacy, had been forced out of the shadows. The invisible weapon was finally rendered visible, trapped forever behind a thin layer of glass. Armed with this insurmountable scientific proof, the authorities swiftly moved in. The New Jersey sanctuary Lydia had carefully chosen provided no protection against a warrant backed by the cold certainty of chemistry. Police tracked her down, arrested her without incident, and dragged her back across state lines to face the judgment of Connecticut. The quiet, grieving widow of Derby was instantly transformed into a national sensation. The trial of Lydia Sherman became a massive public spectacle. Reporters from major metropolitan newspapers rushed to secure seats in the front rows, while morbidly curious spectators packed the wooden benches of the gallery, leaving standing room only. Those who could not force their way through the heavy oak doors stood in the corridors outside, desperate to catch even a glimpse of the woman the press was now calling the Derby poisoner. Inside the courtroom, the very foundation of her decade-long deception was systematically and publicly dismantled. The medical community, whose inherent ignorance and rushed death certificates had unwittingly served as her most reliable accomplices, now became the chief architects of her downfall. Dr. Beardsley took the stand to detail the agonizing, violent final hours of Horatio Sherman, stripping away the illusion of a natural gastric fever. Then, the chemists were called forward to present their devastating findings. They explained the meticulous mechanics of the Marsh Test to a jury of 12 ordinary men, describing how the silver mirror could only be produced by a lethal, deliberate dose of heavy metal. They testified that science could now detect even the most minuscule traces of the white powder, long after the flesh had begun to rot away in the dark. Lydia sat through the proceedings with a terrifying, chilling calmness, listening as the men of science deciphered the secrets she thought she had permanently buried. Her defense attorneys attempted to muddy the waters, suggesting to the jury that perhaps the embalming fluids or the surrounding cemetery soil had somehow contaminated the exhumed body. But the prosecution's science was rigorous, the explanations were clear, and the chain of evidence was entirely unbroken. The days of relying solely on an eyewitness catching a poisoner in the act had officially ended. When the closing arguments concluded, the jury withdrew to deliberate the fate of the woman sitting quietly before them. They did not need to guess, and they did not need to rely on the town's swirling gossip. They had looked at the undeniable chemical reality of what she had done. The scientific evidence was simply insurmountable. The dark era, where a desperate woman could buy a cheap box of rat poison and legally, quietly erase the men who trapped her, was rapidly drawing to a permanent close. The verdict for Lydia Sherman was inevitable once the science had spoken. She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to spend the remainder of her days behind bars, a stark contrast to the comfortable, wealthy widowhood she had so ruthlessly engineered. She died in Wethersfield State Prison in 1878, her name permanently etched into history as the Derby poisoner. The so-called Age of Arsenic did not flourish merely because a deadly toxin was cheap and readily available on the shelves of corner grocery stores. It thrived because it existed perfectly within the vast blind spots of a profoundly flawed medical system and a deeply unequal legal structure. It was an era that handed women a legally mandated life sentence of absolute subjugation under coverture, then casually handed them the ultimate weapon of release for just a few pennies. The relentless advancement of forensic science eventually closed this fatal loophole, rendering the perfect, invisible crime impossible. Yet, the dark history of the women who felt compelled to wield it remains a chilling historical testament to human desperation. When a society meticulously locks every visible exit and leaves its people with no other doors to open, they will inevitably find their own way out in the dark.